Over the decades, there have been a lot of great factions in WWE, to the point where each year has had at least one great one. But what are the best of every 12-month period during the 21st century? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at right now, starting with the top faction of 2000, D-Generation X. Yes, well, this might not have been the original incarnation of DX anymore by the time the new millennium arrived, not with Shawn Michaels being in temporary retirement as a result of a back injury and all. As 2000 dawned, the top faction in WWE were still going strong. And the reason for that was because after spending 1998 and part of 1999 as a babyface act, this was when they turned into a heel group once more. Why were DX heels again in 2000? Well, because now with Triple H married to Stephanie McMahon on screen, he'd become the top villainous authority figure on the show. And that meant, with X-Pac, Billy Gunn, and Road Dogg all serving as his lackeys to do his bidding, he was able to pretty much have his rule of the roost on both Raw and SmackDown. That said, an injury the game picked up in early 2001 would see him miss most of this period, meaning that DX would fall, and the top faction would then instead change to the Alliance. Now, we know that the invasion angle wasn't exactly what you'd call a success. No, even now many consider it to be the biggest botch in wrestling history, as it took what should have been a surefire hit, WWF versus WCW, and turned it into, well, pretty much turned it into WWF versus WWF and some WCW undercard acts. But that's not to say the Alliance, the heel group made up of WCW, ECW, and WWF defector acts, didn't have some highlights. No, if nothing else, it gave us the underrated heel Steve Austin act of that year, the one which allowed the Rattlesnake to play a more paranoid villain. And on top of this, the Alliance also gave a platform for people like Booker T and Rob Van Dam to begin their rise up the ladder in the WWF system, two people who would later go on to hold world titles in WWE. So there was some good to be found here, even if it is mostly forgotten on account of how much the overall angle was hated. And for that reason alone, then, it has to be our choice for top WWF faction of 2001. But what of 2002? Well, for our money, the only reasonable answer to this question is the NWO. No, they weren't the same NWO they'd been back in 1996 anymore at this point, as by then, so much time had passed and the act could never feel as fresh as it had initially. That said, when Hollywood Hogan, Kevin Nash, and Scott Hall all finally returned to WWE in early 2002, this time under their more famous WCW guises, they'd certainly make an impact. And that impact was felt strongly at both No Way Out and at WrestleMania 18, with the former being their debut and the latter being the night Hulk Hogan turned babyface again during his match with The Rock. Obviously though, now that he was a face again, it meant Terry Bollea's time in the New World Order would come to an end here, with this leaving the faction to have to scramble for a while by adding new members in the form of X-Pac, The Big Show, Booker T, and even Shawn Michaels. Ultimately, however, that would result in the group folding once and for all by the time the summer arrived. But even if this was the case, they remained the top faction of WWE in 2002, just as our top faction of WWE in 2003 would undoubtedly be Evolution. Come on now, how could we choose anything different here? After all, Evolution was the most dominating force on the Raw brand during the early 2000s by some distance. And part of the reason it was so dominating was because its ranks were made up of Triple H, Ric Flair, Randy Orton, and Dave Bautista, for future WWE Hall of Famers. What brought all of these men together? Well, the idea was that the game was basically going to create his own version of the Four Horsemen, and in doing so, he would help to elevate two young rookies to the level of main event acts. Sure, 2003 wouldn't be the point either the Viper or the Animal reached the top, but they were well on their way as the year came to an end. And that would allow them and the rest of Evolution to keep going strong into 2004, still as the best faction of WWE. That's right, if 2003 was the year where Evolution first made their presence felt, then 2004 was the year it all started to reach ahead, as it would be here that Randy Orton became the youngest World Heavyweight Champion in the promotion's history. And while this would lead to him getting kicked out of Evolution the following night after Triple H got jealous of his big victory, it proved that the stable was succeeding in its original goal of helping to build up the next generation. And while it was doing this for Orton, it was doing the same for Batista too, albeit with a slower burn, as that angle wouldn't hit its peak until WrestleMania 21 in 2005. But Evolution wouldn't be the top WWE stable of that year. No, instead it would be a SmackDown faction in the cabinet. Now, the cabinet had been riding strong over on the Blue brand as early as the summer of 2004, as this was the point they were formed in order to try and keep the WWE title around JBL's waist. Who were amongst the ranks? Well, aside from Bradshaw, there would also be his Chief of Staff Orlando Jordan, his Secretaries of Defense, the Basham brothers, and his image consultant, Amy Weber. Obviously, then they were successful in their job, as the champ would remain the champ right up until WrestleMania 21. Sure, the wrestling god would lose his gold here, but even after that happened, the cabinet would continue on for the remainder of the year as one of the top heel acts on the Blue brand, as they added a publicist in Jillian Hall for a while. And while they were doing this, Raw would have a new stable which was rising up, one which would go on to become WWE's Best of 2006, the Spirit Squad. Now, anyone who was watching Raw back during the mid-2000s should remember this one, as there was a period back in 2006 where the Spirit Squad were all over the show. Why was that? Well, the faction of male cheerleaders made up of Kenny, Mikey, Johnny, Mitch, and Nikki were basically playing the role of Vince McMahon's personal attack force during his war with the newly reformed original version of D-Generation X. So, as you would expect then, they were all over Raw every Monday night here. And that would even lead to them getting a run as World Tag Team Champions at one point, something which they were able to defend under the Freebird rule and which fully solidified them as the top stable of the year in WWE. Honestly, if this hadn't happened though, they'd probably still be in the same spot on account of all the main event matches they had as a result of their program with Triple H and Shawn Michaels. But it wouldn't be the Spirit Squad who'd be the top faction of WWE in 2007. No, that year the honor would go to the New Breed. Okay, some of you might not remember the New Breed as well today because it was one which was featured over on the WWE CW brand. And given this is not a brand which is well remembered today, so much of it has gone forgotten. But the group of younger wrestlers looking to stand up to the Extreme Legends and make a name for themselves in the process certainly is worthy of discussion even today, as it was an underrated act in general. Yes, whether it was Elijah Burke, Marcus Corvan, Matt Striker, Kevin Thorne, Ariel, or even CM Punk, all of these men and women had something to prove back in 2007. And that meant whenever they were standing in opposition to more established acts such as Tommy Dreamer, The Sandman, or Sabu, they were willing to give everything they had, enough to the point they'd be the clear top faction of the year. But what about 2008? Well, that year we'd be back on SmackDown for the most part, as that was the year of La Familia. Who were La Familia? Well, they were the group that Edge had built around him after he began shacking up on screen with Vicky Guerrero. And a big part of their job here was to make sure the World Heavyweight Championship stayed around the Rated R Superstar's waist. Obviously then, they were able to do a good job of this for a while, as Adam Copeland would end up heading into his first WrestleMania main event against The Undertaker that year as the reigning and defending champion. But it wasn't just Edge who was finding success within La Familia. No, Chavo Guerrero, with the help of people like Kurt Hawkins, Zack Ryder, and Bam Neely, would also manage to become WWE CW World Champion for a while too. And this meant that there was no doubt they were the top faction the company had during 2008. Would things be the same in 2009 though? Well, no. That year things would shift back over to Raw again, the home of The Legacy. Now the idea behind The Legacy was a simple one. Take a group of second and third generation wrestlers and put them together in order to help elevate everyone involved. But it wasn't just about that. No, it was also about creating an army for Randy Orton to utilize as he continued his warpath over the babyface roster on Monday nights, particularly against Triple H and the McMahon family. So it's just as well there were some truly great acts within this heel faction, as aside from the Viper, there was also future WWE champion Cody Rhodes. Sure, other members of the group like Manu, Sim Snuka, and Ted DiBiase Jr. might not have ultimately lived up to expectations. But when you get two generational stars coming out of one group, that's a pretty good batting average. And a part of the reason that Cody is in the spot he's in today is because of the work he did back in 2009 with The Legacy. But let's move on from that for now and over to the top WWE faction of 2010 instead, the Nexus. Of course, when we talk about the Nexus, a big part of what we have to talk about is that initial debut, where at least for one night they felt like the second coming of the NWO. After all, this was the night when a group of game show era NXT stars decided they'd had enough of waiting around and chose to invade Raw to very dramatic effect, with them completely destroying the ringside area here, all while laying waste to stars such as John Cena and CM Punk. Sure, things would stumble from there, but as a result of that first night alone, the Nexus was able to establish themselves as the top WWE faction of 2010. Come on now, this was the group which introduced main roster audiences to performers like Wade Barrett, Ryback, Bray Wyatt, and Bryan Danielson. That said, come 2011, it would have given up its spot as the top faction to an updated form of the group in the new Nexus. What separated the new Nexus from the original Nexus? Well, they were the newer version of them. But, like with New Coke, this wasn't necessarily a huge upgrade. Still though, there were some high points to be found in the group, the biggest of which was probably the fact that they got a new leader in the form of CM Punk, a CM Punk who was just about to skyrocket towards superstardom a few months later when he cut his infamous pipe bomb promo. So really then, it has to be the new Nexus who are considered the best WWE faction of this first year of the new decade. They were certainly better than the other offshoot of the original group, the one by the name of The Core, and two of their members, David Otunga and Michael McKillicuddy, were even good enough to hold the WWE Tag Team titles for a while. But by the time 2012 came around, there would be a new faction in town, one who took over the company for a while. Who are we talking about here? Why, The Shield, of course. Honestly, to pick anyone other than The Shield here would be a huge oversight, because as soon as they burst onto the scene in November of 2012, they became the most dominant act in all of WWE. And this means that even if they were only around for the latter 2 months of the year, they're still the clear choice for number one when it comes to factions in WWE. How did they manage to become so dominant in such a short space of time? Well, by absolutely demolishing some of the biggest names in the industry. We're talking about people like John Cena, Randy Orton, and Daniel Bryan here. Sure, during this early spell, there was a question as to where their true allegiances lay, with it being generally believed that they were working as the personal attack dogs of CM Punk at first. But that only made them more feared in a way, and as 2013 came around and they moved away from the Second City Saint, their reign of dominance would continue to get stronger, which is why they're our choice for the best faction of that year too. That's right, in many ways 2013 was the peak of the Shield's stranglehold over Raw and SmackDown, as it was then that they truly established themselves by going on an undefeated streak which saw them absolutely tear through everyone on the roster. How did they manage this despite still being so new to the main roster? Well, by working as less of a team and more of a single combined unit, with each man working perfectly in tandem with the other. So well would this work out for them, in fact, by the time 2013 was over, Dean Ambrose would be United States Champion, and both Seth Rollins and Roman Reigns would be World Tag Team Champions, with this fully cementing them as a power trio the likes of which WWE had rarely seen. The kind of trio who could pretty much do as they pleased even this early on. And that dominance would carry on into 2014 as well, as this would be the third year in a row where the Shield were the number one stable in all of WWE. Now 2014 really was an interesting one for the three men who would go on to dominate so much of the wrestling industry in years to come. And that's because, while it represented them reaching some of their highest highs, it also gave us their downfall. Yes, even if things started off very strong for the Hounds of Justice here, what with them turning babyface during the spring and then going on to score back-to-back wins against a reformed Evolution on pay-per-view, by the time June came around, it would all be over. Why was this? Well, it would be on the June 2nd episode of Raw that year that Seth Rollins would turn heel on his brothers by laying them out with a steel chair, all before joining up with the villainous Authority. But even if it was a sad end for the once mighty trio, at least they got to go out with a bang in one of the most memorable angles of their era. And this was enough to make it so that, even if they weren't around as a group anymore for the second half of 2014, they remained the best WWE stable of this 12-month period regardless. Obviously though, they wouldn't be around to be the best WWE stable of 2015. No, that year the honor would go to our next subject, The New Day. Now, some people might consider the New Day to be more of a tag team, but given they have three members, they qualify as a faction. After all, if the Shield counts, then so do they. And it was in 2015 that after spending the first few months of their existence struggling, everything finally clicked and they became one of the most beloved acts in all of WWE. What did they do to turn things around? Well, they just became themselves, three goofy pop culture loving nerds. And this suddenly saw fans get on their side. So it was then that when they won the WWE Tag Team title in the spring, everyone would be overjoyed. And they'd continue to be overjoyed as the trio made up of Xavier Woods, Kofi Kingston, and Big E went on to defend those titles for the rest of the year under the Freebird rule. Hell, so dominant of a run would this turn out to be for the New Day, they'd still be the top stable in WWE by the time 2016 came around, and they were making a push to break a record set by Demolition decades prior. Yes, 2016 was the year that Woods, Kingston, and Big E made history, as that was the year they became the, at the time, longest reigning tag team champions in WWE history. Obviously then, this was a huge achievement for them and one which only further solidified their greatness. But that wasn't the only reason that the New Day were the most dominating WWE faction of this calendar year. No, there's also the fact that they continued to deliver whenever the bell rang, whether that be against the Bar, the Usos, or any other set of opponents they were put up against. Honestly, at this point, with the Shield now gone, it looked like this babyface trio were going to be the dominant force in Vince McMahon's promotion for a long time to come yet, not just on screen, but at the merch stands too, as their t-shirts were flying off the shelves here. So there really could be no other option for the best faction in WWE during 2016. And there really could be no other option when we talk about 2017 as well, as that year would mark the third year in a row in which the New Day dominated the field. What did Xavier Woods, Kofi Kingston, and Big E do in 2017 to make it a hat trick? Well, while they lost their tag team titles here, they were still bringing it like no other unit in the company at the time. After all, it was then that their long-term feud with the Usos reached the next level, and this was never more evident than in their tag team Hell in a Cell bout at that year's titular pay-per-view, a bout which stands as one of the better cell matches of that era. Obviously then, they remained as popular as ever with fans in 2017, and they continued to sell a boatload of merch at every show. But while they would continue to be the best main roster faction even into 2018, they weren't the best in all of WWE, as by then an all-new NXT act would have risen to the occasion in the form of the Undisputed Era. Now in truth, the Undisputed Era had actually formed in the summer of 2017 when Adam Cole debuted on the Black and Gold brand and quickly found a pair of allies in his old friends Kyle O'Reilly and Bobby Fish. But it would be in 2018 where the group felt at its strongest, as by that point it had reached its final form with the addition of a fourth member in Roderick Strong. Hell, it would be Roddy who won the NXT tag titles with O'Reilly this year, with that being the second time the group had held those particular belts. Of course, Roddy and Kyle weren't the only ones holding gold within the faction in 2018. No, Adam Cole himself would also become the inaugural North American champion after winning a six-man ladder match for the honor. And that only furthered the idea that the Undisputed Era were fully here to take over, and that once they did take over, they weren't going to be giving up their spot for a long time. Would this be an idea which carried on into 2019 as well? Why, yes it would. And that's why they're our choice for best WWE faction of this year too. That's right, if 2018 was a year of establishing dominance for the Undisputed Era, then 2019 was the year they rooted themselves deeply into NXT as that dominating force. Really, it all began when they started out this period with one goal in mind: to be dripping in gold by the time all was said and done. How would they do in their quest? Incredibly well, as it happened, because at various points during the year, the Red Dragon team of Kyle O'Reilly and Bobby Fish would regain the NXT tag title, Roderick Strong would become North American champion, and Adam Cole would win the NXT world title. Yes, this was the point that the Panama City Playboy finally won the big one, and that solidified the idea that he was a future face of WWE in waiting. Really, there was a feeling here that it was only a matter of time until the Undisputed Era moved up to the main roster as a group and continued their takeover on either Raw or SmackDown as well. Of course, as we all know now though, that wouldn't happen, as eventually all of them would be working for AEW instead. But WWE was able to have another stable in 2020 who did remain there for a while longer, one who dominated the main roster then. That's right, it's time for us to talk about the Hurt Business. Now, the Hurt Business's gimmick was simple. They were four sharply dressed men who took care of business at every opportunity. And more often than not, that business involved hurting people in the ring. Who made up their ranks? Well, that would be Bobby Lashley, Shelton Benjamin, Cedric Alexander, and MVP. As you would expect then, despite being heels, this was an act which many fans quickly fell in love with, as there was just something effortlessly cool about the foursome, and something infinitely engaging about their single-minded desire to be badasses once the bell rang. Would this translate into title success for MVP and company? Yes, it would, because by the time 2020 was over, Lashley would have won the United States title, and Alexander and Benjamin would have become Raw Tag Team Champions. Unfortunately though, this wasn't enough to see them remain together for much longer, as come the following year, WWE would have split the group up, something which allowed the spot of best faction to move over to the Bloodline instead. Really though, is this one any surprise? After all, following their formation in 2021, it didn't take the Bloodline much time at all to become the most talked about thing in all of WWE. And a large part of the reason for this was because of the dominance of their leader, Roman Reigns, as Universal Champion on SmackDown. But it wasn't just Roman who was making the faction must-see. No, there was also the work of his cousins, the Usos, in the tag team division, as well as what his wise man Paul Heyman was doing in a managerial role. No, this wasn't the peak of the group yet, that was still to come, but what 2021 represented was a strong statement of intent that they were going to be taking over the entire company and leading it to new heights, something which proved to be true before all was said and done. So understandably, when we move on into 2022 and talk about that year, we have to talk about the Bloodline as being the best WWE faction then as well. What happened in 2022 to make the Bloodline such an obvious choice for this spot? Well, it continued to go from strength to strength. And considering how strong it was in 2021, that's saying something. But it really is the reality of the situation, because in 2022, that would be the year that Sami Zayn finally entered into the orbit of the faction and took things to its highest of highs. Yes, when people think of the peak of the Bloodline, they often think of the goofy antics of the honorary Uce as he tried to find a permanent spot within the group, and this was an angle which largely played itself out during that 12-month period. Really, if you want to talk about the key elements which led to WWE's surge in popularity around that time, then Sami in the Bloodline has to be one of the most important of them all. So there's no way we could pick anything else for our choice of best WWE faction of this year. And the situation wouldn't change in 2023 either, as that year would mark the third year straight in which Roman Reigns and company completely and utterly dominated the promotion. Interestingly though, while this was another dominating year for the Bloodline, it would also be the year where things started to fall apart for them, as it would be the period of the Bloodline Civil War. And it all began when, in the spring of 2023, Sami Zayn finally exited the group after deciding he'd had enough of the Tribal Chief's ways. Then, once that happened, the summer would see the Usos part ways with the faction too. So in some ways, it felt like the end for the once mighty stable. Even if this was the case though, it would still be the top faction of WWE in 2023, as the whole angle remained red hot, probably the hottest thing in all of wrestling then. And with Solo Sikoa by this point being added to the equation, it meant Roman continued to have backup by his side even when his other cousins were no longer there. Come 2024 though, the head of the table would finally fall to Cody Rhodes, and this would leave a spot open for best faction in WWE, a spot which was ultimately filled by the Judgment Day. Honestly, if there was any WWE faction during the 2020s which was going to challenge the Bloodline's reign of dominance, then it was the Judgment Day. As while the former were ruling the roost over on SmackDown, by that point, the latter were very much the powerhouse group over on Raw. And they'd done that by having some of the biggest stars the brand had at their disposal in the form of Finn Balor, Damian Priest, Dominic Mysterio, and of course, Rhea Ripley. That said, 2024 would also see big changes within the heel faction, as it would be in the summer that both Ripley and Priest were kicked out in favor of Liv Morgan and Raquel Rodriguez. But rather than lead to the downfall of the Judgment Day, these changes only seemed to strengthen their stranglehold over Monday nights all the more. Hell, there's a reason they spent a large part of this year with not just the Raw Tag Team titles in their possession, but also the Women's World Heavyweight title. By the time 2025 came around, however, even the Judgment Day would have to sit back and take a second place spot to the new top faction in all of WWE. Who are we talking about this time? Who else but The Vision? Yes, it was at WrestleMania 41 that Seth Rollins got a big-time win over both CM Punk and Roman Reigns after aligning himself with Paul Heyman. And now that he had Heyman by his side, it wouldn't take long for the pair to build a whole stable around themselves, one which also included Braun Breaker and Bronson Reed. Sure, it would take a while before this foursome got an official name, but that didn't stop them from taking over the Raw brand anyway. As it stands right now, in fact, following the addition of Becky Lynch into the group, the fivesome now known as The Vision are in control of two of the top prizes on Monday nights in the form of both the World Heavyweight title and the Women's Intercontinental title. So really, we should expect them to continue being the powerhouse of the flagship for some time to come, perhaps even well into 2026 as well. But even if they aren't, and someone else takes their spot next year, they'll still be one of the best factions WWE has produced during the 21st century, just like every other group we've talked about today.